Welcome to Storytelling. This week's guest is a world-class communications expert working at the intersection of leadership, clarity and storytelling. As the founder of the Strictly Speaking Group, he has helped thousands of professionals, from emerging leaders to Fortune 50 executives, communicate confidently in high-stakes situations. A top-rated LinkedIn learning instructor, he is best known for his work with multilingual leaders and non-native English speakers, blending linguistics, cultural intelligence and inclusive communication to challenge accent bias and help people speak with clarity without losing who they are. With a doctorate in dramaturgy from Yale and a career span in academia and performance, he brings both rigor and creativity to the evolving conversation around accents in the workplace. In this episode, he shares what it truly means to communicate with confidence and authenticity, no matter your accent. Please welcome Peter Novak. Hello, Peter, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Debbie.
Peter, accents tell our story before we even say our name, but only some of us get told that we have an accent. Why do you think that certain accents are seen as normal while others are treated as different?
Well, you bring up a couple of really great points in that question. The first is that all of us have accents. We all have an accent. We all belong to a group that tells our story by the way that we speak. And it's really interesting to me because a lot of people get asked, where are you from? Whenever they speak in a way that is different from the majority of people in that area. It's called an out-group or in-group accent. And so people who emigrate, who are here from a different area of the world, often get asked, and it's a very tiring question for them because it others them, right? It makes them sound like, you're not from here, are you? And it's a really interesting dynamic that happens all the time. And they get so tired of being asked that question, where are you from? And so one of the things that I do is I never ask that question anymore. I change it. And I say things like, what's your story? Or where do you call home? Which is a really lovely way to allow that person to answer how they want to answer. To be able to say, well, I live in Brighton now, but I am originally from wherever. And that allows people to really have the freedom to answer how they wish. That's the first part of my response, I would say. People recognize accents very easily. We recognize that people speak differently from us very, very quickly. Like you said, even without speaking your name. But the second part of the answer that I would say is that names are also really important. And we tend to mispronounce oftentimes people's names without realizing it. And I was doing a workshop recently where 50%, it was for a global team, 50% of the participants changed the way they pronounced their name because other people couldn't pronounce it the way that they say it.
Yeah.
And I think we have to recognize how powerful changing one's name is and how personal that decision is. And I guess that the example that I would also give is people say, well, it's really quite easy to say someone else's name, pronounce someone else's name. And I'm like, no, it's actually not. If that person's sounds of their names are not in your lexicon, are not in the way that you speak. So for example, if you come from China or Thailand, the language is a tonal language. There are 4 different tones in Mandarin, similar in Thai, and you can pronounce the name correctly. You can say the vowels and the consonants correctly, but if you're not using the right intonation, then you're actually not saying the person's name the right way. And it could mean something completely different. And so it's a challenge to do. And so I always encourage people to, in Zoom meetings, to try and spell out their name and how it's pronounced in their Zoom. Or to use LinkedIn, and you can record the pronunciation of your name on your phone. I'm a big proponent in making sure that you're trying to pronounce someone's name correctly.
I totally agree with you on that, because I always make a point of asking someone who I'm speaking to, how do I pronounce your name?
Mhm.
And trying to get them to coach me to it, because I wouldn't like it if someone wouldn't say my name correctly
Mhm.
or would call me something else. And people change their names to make it easier for others, but I think it's nice when we make the effort.
Totally agree. And you can't say things like, oh, I'll never be able to pronounce that. Let me just call you this, right? People do that, which is so strange to hear. Or they shorten the person's name without their permission, or they do something, they call them something else because they can't pronounce it. And what a difficult thing for the person on the other end, right? And so I think it's fascinating. You also shouldn't say, oh, that's going to be really difficult for me, and keep, just the effort of trying the first time is good. Don't belabor the point and say, oh, I'm never going to be able to get that, or boy, that's a really challenging or difficult name for me. Don't belabor the point. Just try, record them if you can so that you can rehearse it for yourself on the other side.
That brings us nicely to the topic of accent bias,
Mhm.
which often operates under the radar. It's not always overt. How do you see it showing up, especially in workplaces and professional settings?
Yeah, there have been so many studies in the US and the UK around accent bias, and how, even as we were just talking about names on a CV before a person even opens their mouth get coded sometimes as being other, right? As being not from here. And so don't get the same selection from recruiters in the same way. So it happens even before a person shows up when you're reading their CV or their resume. And that's part of it. Then, when a person does show up, there are lots of studies, mostly in the UK, and there's some really interesting websites around this that talked about accent bias in Britain and how prevalent it really was. And they did a study in 2022 with candidates who were applying to law school, or candidates in law school, I believe, and had people listen to 5 different types of accents. Received pronunciation, the Queen's English or the King's English, as it is now.
Yeah.
And then estuary, a Western accent, maybe a Geordie accent. I can't remember exactly, but there were about 5 different accents. And they found that in the UK, bias towards specific accents hasn't changed in over 50 years, that there is still an enormous amount of bias when listening to people. But there are also some really interesting dynamics around it. Oh, multicultural London English was one of the other accents. Do you know about multicultural London English? Yes?
No, actually. I mean, I've not heard the expression before. I'm guessing it's people that sound like me.
Uh, let me explain what it is. It is a mix of sort of Cockney with West African sounds, with Jamaican or Caribbean sounds, all mixed up together. And it's become quite popular in many parts of London and has spread, I think, through social media and popular culture. And it uses different slang and terminology. Probably you'll hear people say, instead of thing, they'll say ting. They substitute a T or a D for a sound like that. They'll use bruv. They'll use, the VF switch that happens sometimes. It's a really interesting dynamic. And so younger people in this study that I was referring to earlier don't have the same biases that older people have. So, for example, older people will still look at received pronunciation as being higher status, whereas younger people don't make the same classification. So, I think there's some really interesting things that are happening with younger people in the way that they speak, in the way that they want to speak. But let me ask you, Debbie, do you change your accent ever when you're speaking? Do you shift into a different form sometimes?
I probably do, because I hadn't heard of the phrase that you'd used,
Hmm.
multicultural English, before. But for me, it's normal, yeah, street
Hmm.
talk or street slang. But I hadn't realized there was a name for it. Occasionally, if I'm sparring with people, I may say ting rather than thing, but that's because we're together. But I think people do code
Yes.
switch depending on the group that they're in, the circle
Yep.
of people that they're with. If you're in a relaxed situation with friends, then your speech becomes more relaxed. If you're in a formal setting, my daughter will say, "You sound really posh saying that." And I'm like, "Do I? I thought I sounded normal." I think it very much depends on the
Mhm.
situation that you're in and the circumstances you're in, the people that you're with, whether you're in a formal or informal setting, whether you're in a family setting or
Mhm.
etc. And that determines
Mhm.
how you speak, the slang that
Mhm.
you may or may not use. It will determine, for example, if you're with a group of friends and everyone's got different accents and everyone's trying to teach everyone different things. Like I will try and teach my American friends how to say "in it"
In it, right.
and think like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, that sort of stuff.
Exactly. And it can be really fun to do that when you're with a group of people to try and understand and how to do, different types of accents. It can be really fun to do. Yeah, we code switch all the time. And, when I'm coaching people, people will say, well, I speak the same, no matter what. And I'm like, do you really? Do you speak the same way to your husband or wife that you do to your kids? Probably not. Or to your parents or to people at work. You probably do code shift in a variety of ways. But in England, code shifting, it's really interesting. You said it was your daughter who says you sound, really posh when you say that. There's another study that shows, I think, about 25% of people in the UK will change their accent to sound more posh in different situations. And so I think there's a real understanding oftentimes, and this is the work that I do not in England necessarily, but around the globe, around people who speak English as a second language, who have accents that are
Mm.
not native English accents often. And when they're at work,
Yeah.
they often feel that they're doing, and they are doing a lot more cognitive work than native English speakers. Because for us, we just
Mhm.
speak. And the majority of people in the UK and Australia and Canada and the US who are native English speakers, the majority only speak one language. We're mostly monolingual,
Mhm.
like up 75% or more in all of those countries. And so you have to recognize that when there are people who are speaking English as their second or third or fourth language at work, that oftentimes they are translating in their minds. They are translating before they speak or while they're speaking, and they are doing some really heavy lifting that native speakers don't have to do. And native speakers don't recognize and realize how much work that is and how challenging it is for people. And there are lots of really interesting studies at work about what happens at work. So I was working with a team the other day from Latin America, and they speak three languages. They speak English, Spanish, and Portuguese among themselves. And they go in and out of all of those languages when they're speaking to each other. And they ask more questions of each other. And they allow more time for responses and reflection and reaction. As soon as a native English speaker enters the room, all of that linguistic complexity shifts and they only speak in English. And they can't use all of the languages and ways of communicating that they've used in the past among all of them. They have to focus on English. And really interesting studies that show that what happens is they shift, it becomes more competitive to speak. They don't have as much time to process information, so they're put on the spot a lot faster. They gain native speakers' tempo and rhythm, so they'll speed up instead of slowing down and helping themselves feel more confident. So lots of really interesting dynamics happen as soon as a native English speaker enters the room. And so I think being aware of these things, in fact, the study that I was talking about earlier in the UK said that one of the best ways to avoid accent bias is to just be aware of it from the beginning. So let's say your company is doing interviews with candidates. It's say, and just to remind everybody, we don't discriminate based on accent, on gender, on sexuality, on a variety of factors, on marriage, on, all of those things that are legal or not in your country or where you're from. In the US, we don't have laws on accent discrimination. France does, which is really interesting. It's called glottophobia. And it is about how it's illegal to discriminate based on someone's accent because the Parisian accent is deemed as the most, the best French accent. And I think you mentioned it earlier, when we think about who says what's standard and what's not. You were talking to me before the podcast about going to Spain to speak. Tell me, where did you study again?
I went to Salamanca in Spain.
Salamanca from Spain, because you said that
it's the purest form.
This purest form.
They think the purest form of Spanish.
Right.
And I thought, if I'm going to put myself on the spot, let me go there.
Yep.
And be forced to speak Spanish and learn it well.
Yes, exactly.
And then the reverse happens. So, for example, when they're speaking to me, I'm now translating in my head.
That's right.
And I really value the experience of non-native speakers when I'm speaking to them in English and I'm being asked, could you slow down?
Mm-hmm.
And then I realize it's because they're trying to translate.
Mm-hmm.
But I think also what I also try to do is not use slang or idioms to try and confuse them further.
That's right.
And try and speak in a way that is more understandable. Otherwise, you're constantly trying to explain things. Like if I say, I'm trying to think of a phrase now. What kind of phrase? Quick, Debbie.
No, I know. It's really hard to do, right? It's really hard to think of phrases.
Yeah. As soon as I think of a phrase, they're like, what phrase can I think of? As sweet as a nut.
Sweeter than nut?
As sweet as a nut.
As sweet as a nut.
Sweet as a nut.
I've never heard that before.
Have you not? As sweet as a nut just means like it's really nice. It's as sweet as a nut.
That's a total British idiom.
It is.
It's a
British idiom. Yes,
That's so funny. As sweet as a nut. Yeah, right. All right, isn't it? I can't do it. Oh, so bad. It's really hard for Americans to do British accents. It's really challenging.
I think you did it really well. I thought you did it really well.
Well, I studied accents, for a long time, and it's one of the reasons why I think I help people speak in English with more confidence without changing their accent. There's a whole way of doing that I think is really helpful for folks so that they don't focus on how they're saying things. They focus on what they're saying and making a connection. We use something called phrasal verbs all the time in English. And no one who speaks English as a native language knows what a phrasal verb is because we don't learn them when we're growing up. We just speak them. There are thousands and thousands of phrasal verbs in English. Let me give you an example. There was a great, I think he's a Ukrainian comic in the 80s who said, English is such a strange language. First you have a tree, right? If you have a tree, first you chop it down and then you chop it up. You chop it down from, and then you chop it up into little pieces. And it's like, yes, it makes no sense. It's the up. It makes no sense. And so a phrasal verb is usually an adjective or an adverb combined with a preposition. Think of how we say, hold on, hold off, hold over, hold, right? All of these different verbs that when they're combined, they mean something different than the original verb. And we use them all the time. There are thousands of them. And we are completely unaware that we are using these verbs that are context dependent, that we use constantly and consistently. And it's really interesting and challenging for non-native speakers to understand that. I work with executives and people on global teams to sound more confident in English without really changing their accent or worrying about their accent. And it's really fun to do that work. But I want to get back to what we were talking about when you said you went to Spain and you said they speak Spanish really well in Salamanca. And There are so many different forms of Spanish around the world. There's Latin American Spanish, and it differs by region and country. Argentinian Spanish uses very recognizable forms of pronunciation that people can immediately say, oh, they're from Argentina. People from Colombia are very proud of their speech and how it sounds like the purest form of Spanish as well. And so, who gets to set those standards? Who gets to say that this form of English is better than or worse than another form of English or Spanish or any other language? And it happens when there is, sort of power, when there happens a lot from major corporations in broadcasting that established a way of speaking originally. Now, the BBC has shifted away from that, which, of course, you had to have sort of BBC pronunciation for things. They don't have that anymore. They have much more regional representation, both in sound and in people who are reporting the news. And so I always think it's really interesting to ask who says what's right and what's not. And I really like to challenge those notions of what's correct and what isn't, because I think it exposes some power differences. And you'll hear a lot of people who will say, oh, they don't speak English properly, or they don't, right? And it's like, come on. I think we have to really erase what's proper and right in our minds and be open to a much wider range of Englishes, the ways that English is used around the world, because there are more non-native speakers of English than there are native speakers of English. And so I think we have to be much more open to the diversity of sounds.
And talking about the diversity of sound, why do people so often equate a certain accent with intelligence,
Yep.
clarity, or competence? And there's that striking idea that it's not what you say that matters. It's whether you sound like someone's idea of a trustworthy person.
That's right.
So how do we start changing that perception?
So there was a really interesting study that was done in Canada. And this is how it worked. Let's say your car has broken down in a city that you don't know, and your battery for your phone is dead, and you need to find the closest garage. And so you ask two people, one of them sounds exactly like you and sends you in one direction. The other person is foreign to you and sends you in a completely opposite direction. Who do you trust more? And the study found that we tend to trust people who sound like us. It's sort of a natural component. We tend to trust people who sound like us. Except, and this is the interesting part of the study, if the person who was from an outgroup or foreign, quote unquote, accent spoke with greater confidence, then it erased much of that bias and much of that difference. And so you have to ask the question, what does confident speech in English sound like? When you are describing somebody who sounds confident, how would you describe them?
It would be in the delivery of what they've said.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the content of what they've said as well.
Yep.
For example, regardless of accent, is what they've just said, is it relevant to the discussion or situation? Are their ideas and suggestions relevant? Are they good? Despite the difference in sound and accents, is what they're trying to say
clear?
Good.
Good. Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. I think you've hit on some really important points. One is, what's the content of what they're saying? Is it contributing to the conversation? Is it contributing to what we're actually doing in the moment? And then the second thing you said was delivery, how they're actually delivering this. And so what's really interesting is that in English, we have three basic intonations. The first is a downward intonation, which signals conclusion. When we're finished speaking, you hear the tone at the end go down. And we do it in two different ways. One is if I say, I'm a professor, you can hear it steps up and jumps down. I'm a professor. And then I say, I teach math, and you can hear it glide down at the end. I teach math. And so when you hear that ending, that conclusiveness in speech, it can sound more confident. Mm-hmm. If then the other intonation that we have in English is the upward inflection, which is asking a question. right? And speaking like this. And in the US, there's something called upspeak. I don't know if there's an equivalent in the UK, but it's where you speak by using an upward intonation whenever you're speaking. And as I'm speaking, it's really interesting because you're starting to nod your head a little more because I'm using this upward inflection all the time. And it becomes exhausting to listen to for people.
Yeah.
And because you're constantly feeling that when you're listening to me, you have to say, mm-hmm, yeah, mm-hmm. You're like forcing someone to respond in a way because you're using these upward inflections all the time. And then we have something in English called the sustained or flat inflection. And that's so or no, which is a continuation of thought. I haven't finished by going down and I haven't finished by going up. And so you know that the person is thinking about what they're saying. That's what makes it sound like we're actually thinking in the present moment. Notice how I just said we're actually thinking in the present moment, and we draw out those sounds. And so that's when you understand that using the downward inflection more often than the upward, and using how those inflections work and how we listen for in English certain key words in a sentence. Focus words is what we call them. And in any sentence, there's only about 3 or 4 words that get the most meaning or carry the most weight when we're speaking. You can hear me doing it now. I'm focusing on specific words as I'm delivering them. And so you can sort of like underline them and know those are the words that carry the most meaning and so are better understood. And so if non-native speakers focus on those and they focus on downward inflection and they have a volume when they're speaking, all of a sudden that sounds confident to our English native speaking ears. And so those are the qualities, and it has nothing to do with accent. Those are the qualities of speech and speaking with pauses effectively. All of those things are what we call prosody. And that's the musicality of speech and language. And if you can learn those, and it's very simple to do, then your speech can be much more understood by folks who speak English as their native language.
Peter, what gives you hope about how we're evolving in our understanding of language and inclusion?
Oh, I think the younger generation is already way beyond. I mean, I am in my 6th decade. I have been a professor. I was a professor for 25 years, and I marveled at the way young people use language. I just marveled at their approach and flexibility and ways that they introduce new terms and concepts and ideas. And so I have great hope that we are not becoming more calcified and saying that you have to sound a specific way. I have great hope that there is a much more multiplicity of sounds in the workplace and in our home lives that will be recognized and validated and accepted. Yeah, I think younger generations are just more able to mix things up. And older generations are much more rigid in their way of perceiving the world, oftentimes.
If listeners could change one habit tomorrow to become more inclusive communicators, what would it be?
If businesses could do this, here's what I would say. I would say first, if you're a native English speaker, be aware. There's a famous couple in the 1940s in Hollywood film called Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And they were a dancing couple. And the common phrase is, Fred Astaire was thought to be one of the best dancers of all time. That his partner, Ginger Rogers, did everything Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in high heels, right? Because she was following him. And that's what I think we have to recognize as native speakers, is that there's a whole different way of honoring and respecting the time that it takes for non-native speakers to contribute, perhaps in a meeting, to prepare a presentation, to be put on the spot with spontaneous speaking. All of those things are often different for non-native English speakers. And once you're aware of it, I think it opens up more possibilities for people to change what they're doing in the workplace.
And also in the workplace, one thing that I like to remind people is that A brilliant idea can come wrapped in any accent whatsoever.
Absolutely.
So, what's your hope for how we listen in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Is that we become better listeners, first of all. We understand the biases that we are using to listen with, that we don't gauge someone's intelligence based on their ability to speak our language as fluently as we do. I have friends who speak English as their second or third language who are so much better communicating in English than I am. And I am humbled by that and want to recognize that, right? They use completely different vocabulary that I use oftentimes. It's more rich, it's more varied. I'm blown away by multilingual people's ability to be able to do that. And a really good part about being a multilingual speaker, too, is that it's a superpower. There are lots of studies that show that you are less likely to develop degenerative, brain diseases like Alzheimer's and things like that, that you're able to switch between different tasks more easily, that you remember more. There's all sorts of benefits to being multilingual. So for those who are monolingual, start learning another language, just like you did, Devi, right, with Spanish, because it opens up a whole new world for you of experience, of understanding. And so it's a wonderful way, I think, to both understand how non-native speakers, like you said, when you're speaking Spanish, all of a sudden you have to process differently. When you understand that process, I think we're much more open to people who speak English in a different way from our own.
There's one thing that always comes up when I'm with non-native speakers, and it's something that you just mentioned, and that's the interpretation of what's being said. Sometimes you may say something and they've interpreted it something completely different and may actually get offended by what you've just said without you actually realizing. I've just said something that's normal, but to them it's not normal. And I think it requires you to be patient enough to provide some explanation and context so that they understand. But it's having that patience in knowing that when you're speaking with a non-native speaker, what is normal to you it may require explanation for others.
Yes, and there are some ways to do that too. One is when you're speaking to back channel or to say, to say something. This works in business as well, is like, I'm not sure I was as clear as I could have been. Can you tell me what you heard, so that I can make sure that I was communicating effectively? In other words, you don't put the burden on the other speaker, right? On the listener. You put the burden on yourself to make sure that you are clear as much as possible. And I don't know about you, but like when you were speaking Spanish, if you said something and people didn't understand what you were saying, there's this automatic feeling of, oh my gosh, I didn't pronounce it correctly. I didn't say it correctly. And you feel the burden immediately on yourself. But if you've got someone else on the other side who's saying, did you mean this? Or, can you explain again using different words? Then you've got someone who's an active participant in helping clarity and meaning be exchanged. So you're right. It does require us to be more open, be more understanding, to apologize when we don't get it right, when I don't understand someone, to say, what's that one word? I understood everything you said in that sentence, but that one word I didn't understand. Can you write it for me? Can you spell it for me even? But oftentimes when people spell using the alphabet, their pronunciation might be different. And so instead of saying A for alpha, they might say ah instead, because of the pronunciation of the way their alphabet works. There's so many different permutations of how language affects our pronunciation. It's just fascinating to me.
Peter, why is it so important for you to focus in this area?
Because there aren't very many speech coaches out there, and that's what I do. I'm a speech and communications coach after having been a professor for so long, and I saw it in my classroom. I see it in global businesses around the world, that there's a lot of misunderstanding and that there's a lot that we can do to help empower people. And that's what I like to do, is empower people to feel their best and to communicate as clearly as they want to. And so it's important because I think it changes business outcomes. I think it changes personal relationships. I think when we are more open to a diversity of sound, we become more empathetic, and that we need more empathy in the world.
Peter, thank you so much for being a guest on his podcast and for enlightening us with the power of accents.
Thank you, Debbie. It was great speaking with you.
If you would like further details about Peter and the Strictly Speaking group, then please follow the links in the show notes.